My name is Maria Mayorga, and I'm the poultry technical specialist for the Americas region. And I'm delighted to attend the second seminar on African swine fever, transmission and risk management. As a technical specialist, I get so many tasks in the region. And I act as a music representative in technical events related to the industry and select specialized speakers to participate in our technical events. Also, I work on animal utilization research projects that helps to differentiate and create a preference for US soy. I also provide general technical assistance to different industry members, solving technical challenges or addressing them to other high-level experts like the ones we invited today to talk about African swine fever. But why African swine fever is so relevant for our customers in the Americas? Well, African swine fever has a huge socio-economic impact, especially in countries that export pork products, as well as in countries where these products are important sources of protein. In addition to high mortality rates, ASF directly affects the economies of those affected countries because its detection triggers national and international trade restrictions on animals and pork products, as well as the implementation of costly control strategies to eradicate the disease. In general, the emergence of African swine fever decreases pork production and increases pork prices, affecting food security. Moreover, this disease reduces pork demand due to loss of consumers' trust in food quality and safety. Since we don't have any current vaccine available, and there's no a single recipe for preventing ASF, education, effective communication, and the involvement of all stakeholders at each stage of the process, together with the support of local and international veterinary authorities, is pivotal to increase disease awareness and understanding of the risk and consequences associated with a potential outbreak. USEC has created this America's seminar series on African swine fever to share relevant information on its current situation worldwide. In our first seminar, we learned about the ASF basics, including clinical symptoms, how the virus spreads, as well as its global situation and economic impact. Today, we will focus on ASF transmission and risk management and learn about the USDA and CBP mitigation approach, African swine fever transmission, and that transmission associated with feed and feed ingredients. Understanding the role of feed ingredients as transboundary vectors for viral diseases and contamination risks present at several critical control points during feed manufacturing is key for our customers. This risk include exposure of post-harvest grains drying on roadways to vehicles transporting infected pigs, and exposure of stored ingredients to infectious pests. Therefore, feed biosecurity is essential for the preventing ISF virus entry onto farms. Also, I'd like to invite you to our third last seminar of this series. This event will address African swine fever risk mitigation and will take place next Wednesday, starting at 8 a.m. Central Time. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce to our speakers today. First, I'd like to welcome and introduce Dr. Zabel. Pam is an Iowa native growing up on a farm with hogs, sheep, and row crops. She earned her Bachelor of Science and DVM degrees from Iowa State University. After working in a mixed animal practice for 9 years, Pam accepted a position as the Director of Swine Health Information and Research at the National Pork Board. Then, in 2009, she joined the Center for Food Security and Public Health at the Iowa State University, where she was responsible for projects focusing on swine diseases, swine health, and foreign animal disease preparedness. One of those projects included the Secure Port Supply Plan, which focuses on business continuity for port premises with no evidence of the FAD infection located in a regulatory control area. In January 2020, Pam returned to the National Pork Board, where she continues to work on the foreign animal disease prevention and preparedness, focusing on surveillance research and the certified swine sample collection training program. Now, and it's also my pleasure to introduce Dr. Maria Celia Antonioli. Celia is a swine health senior staff officer with the Aquaculture, Swine, Equine, and Poultry Commodity Health Center in APHIS Veterinary Services. She was born and raised in Buenos Aires, Argentina, obtained her DVM degree from Buenos Aires University and a PhD in epidemiology from Colorado State University. Celia joined APHIS Veterinary Services in 2008, and in 2015, she became the Director of Surveillance Design and Analysis Unit. In this role, she provided leadership for the design, evaluation, analysis, and communication of surveillance of livestock and poultry diseases, both domestically and internationally. In March 2018, Celia joined the swine health team, where she is involved in the implementation of all swine surveillance activities, including active surveillance for swine foreign hemorrhagic fevers. Celia participates as a subject matter expert for classical and African swine fever in several international working groups, such as OIE, FAO, GEMP, and other international and domestic forums. It's also my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cassandra Jones. Dr. Jones is a professor in the Department of Animal Sciences and Industry at the Kansas State University. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in animal nutrition and undergraduate research. CASE's research efforts revolve around the area of livestock feed and pet food safety, including methods to prevent the transmission of African swine fever virus and salmonella through animal food. She is a regular resource to FDA and USDA as they work to develop science-based regulations, as well as to industry as they build best practice recommendations. In her 8 years as a faculty member, Dr. Jones has more than 70 peer-reviewed publications, 125 abstracts, and $8 million in research grants and gifts. She earned her Bachelor of Science and Master of Science from Kansas State University and her PhD at Iowa State University. She and her husband Spencer have 3 children, Ty, Hayden, and Hadley, and raise Angus cattle. It's also my pleasure to introduce USEC's own Kearney Knapp. Kearney is USEC's Focus Area Director for Animal and Aquaculture Nutrition Meal. In this role, Kearney is responsible for managing the global portfolio for USEC animal and aqua programs with stakeholders and directing the development of a strategic utilization plan in this program area. Kearney comes to USEC from the USDA, where she served in several roles, including Chief of Staff for the Assistant Secretary of Administration, Chief of Staff for Research, Education, and Economics, and Senior Policy Advisor for the Foreign Agricultural Service. She also spent 4 years as Director of International Trade Policy for the National Pork Producers Council in DC, where she directed regulatory trade policy efforts for sanitary and technical barriers to trade for US pork and pork products. Kearney brings scientific expertise to the table, having worked for BASF as product manager for US corn fungicides and Elanco Animal Health as senior marketing associate for US swine and sales representative for US beef. Kearney grew up on in a family soybean, corn, and pig farm in Washington, Iowa, and earned a Bachelor of Science degree in agricultural business with a minor in international agriculture from Iowa State University. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all, and I wish you a great session. Dr. Pam, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you for allowing me to join you today to discuss African swine fever and some of our concerns around ASF transmission. Before we get started into the transmission side of things, I think it's important that we review one very important factor that was discussed last week, and that's around African swine fever, the survival of the virus. We know that this virus is highly resistant in the environment, especially at lower temperatures. And we're very concerned about the amount of time that it can survive in feces at room temperature, in contaminated pens, blood products, pork products, and frozen carcasses. And I think it's important that we review that, because as we start talking about ASF transmission and some of the concerns we have as far as the virus entering this country, or if it would come to infect animals here in the United States, some of the concerns around survival and why we worry about its survival and how that might affect the transmission of the virus. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about ASF transmission into the United States. And I think one very important thing that we need to discuss when we look at this is the role that Customs and Border Protection plays. We can see here some pictures that you may have seen on the internet. The one to the right there is the beagle who discovered this roasted pig head in a traveler's luggage in Atlanta. And we can't emphasize enough the importance of these handlers and these beagles, or these beagle teams, and the role that they play in preventing the transmission of the virus into the United States. And then talking too about the transmission through pork and pork products that are smuggled in addition into traveler's luggage, but as well hidden with other items that are imported into the United States. And the fact that the virus, again, can survive in uncooked or undercooked pork products for extended periods of time is one of our big concerns as to how it might enter the United States. In the United States, when these types of products are confiscated by Customs and Border Protection, they are correctly disposed of or incinerated. We don't, in the United States here, we don't test these products to see if they actually are carrying the virus, but they are correctly disposed of. However, some other countries do test the products that they confiscate in their country. And you can see here on the slide, South Korea, prior to their becoming infected, they routinely did test these products and did find them positive for ASF. Taiwan is another country that routinely tests products, as well as the carcasses that will sometimes wash up on their beaches. And they test those individuals, those carcasses and those products, and have tested positive for ASF in some situations. And in addition, Australia is another country, again, that tests those products that are confiscated. And they have had products test positive different times for ASF, as well as occasionally for foot and mouth disease. So again, the positive here is not to reflect that the country itself is positive, but that the fact that they do test these products, and we know that these products that are being smuggled in are indeed a threat for ASF in the United States. There was a study that came out a few years ago now, looking at the risk of international travel. And some of the concerns, of course, we have in addition to these products that are being smuggled in with the air passengers are also people's clothing, footwear, and other items that they are bringing in from ASF positive countries. And this particular research looked at what that risk is. And it is published in the Journal of Scientific Reports. And it was stated in the article that the risk of ASF has doubled since the ASF epidemic began in China in 2018. They determined that 5 airports had over 90% of that risk. And you can see them listed there: Newark, George Bush in Los Angeles, the JFK in New York, and San Jose in California. So a lot of efforts are being placed in these 5 airports to mitigate that risk. And I know that Dr. Antognoli is going to talk a lot more about those government efforts. So hopefully I tee her up adequately at presenting what our concern is, from an ASF transmission of the virus into the country. It was stated in this article by one of the officials that there's a high probability that the virus is actually reaching our borders, but not actually entering the United States due to all the efforts of the Customs and Border Protection. So we can't emphasize and commend them for what they're doing enough and continue to do to help protect and reduce that risk of ASF transmission from ASF positive countries. So in the effort to talk about our concerns of product coming into the United States and of our animals here becoming positive, we've talked about those contaminated pork products from an international perspective. But we also have concern if they do make their way into the United States. For pigs in the US to be positive, of course, it has to enter the United States, it has to make its way onto a farm, and it actually needs to infect the animals. So if these products do make it past our efforts in customs protection and actually make it onto the farm, there's concern if they actually get access to the animals. And so we have concerns about ingestion of the contaminated pork products being fed to the pigs, both being introduced into the United States, as well as if the virus would get here, is that another way that it could spread within the United States? And so the Swine Health Protection Act regulates the feeding of plate waste that contains meat products here in the United States. If it is fed to pigs, it has to be cooked to a certain temperature, and that temperature has to be maintained for a specific period of time. So in the United States, again, that is a federal rule, but we do have 27 states where the feeding of the plate waste is permitted. And again, that is regulated, but also in the remaining 23 states, it is actually prohibited. So it is not allowed for this plate waste to be even cooked and fed to the animals. Of course, I have feral pigs question mark there, not to question the role that they could play, but there's a lot of discussion what happens if it does get into the feral pigs, and is this one of the ways that could occur? Is there the possibility of contaminated pork products making its way into a landfill where feral pigs may have access to it in some states where there are higher feral pig populations? Or is it a matter that maybe in some of these systems that utilize the cooking and the feeding of the plate waste, do these animals, if it's not done adequately, do these animals that are fed this plate waste could become infected, and what's the risk of those animals having contact with feral swine? So again, that whole concept of that contaminated pork products, we're concerned about it being a transmission method of bringing it into the United States, as well as possibly infecting animals in an area and the feral pigs that they might have contact with. So when we look at ASF transmission, we look at it through 3 different ways. And one is a direct contact, one is indirect contact, and then in a minute, we'll talk about the arthropod transmission. The direct contact is that contact with that infected pig. The indirect contact covers with fomites, and I could add on that list, that's where we talk about our contaminated pork products. So let's talk about the concerns with ASF with each of those. So of course, direct contact is a situation where an animal is infected on a farm, and we worry about the animals surrounding that pig, or if we transport pigs from one site to another, again, introducing that infected pig on the site and having direct contact with the other animals and infecting them. The infected pig can secrete the virus through all their secretions, excretions, blood tissues, and so on. So there's a lot of different substances there from that infected pig, and opportunity for infection. When we look at indirect contact, we talk about fomites, and that's where we play the big role, of course. We can carry the virus on our footwear or our clothing, in our vehicles, including our transport vehicles, on our equipment that we might share between the sites, and through our supplies. And, you know, when we look at in some countries where the virus has traveled great distances, it's most likely traveled through something that we as humans have done, whether we, again, carried it on our footwear, clothing, whether it was a vehicle that was contaminated and animals had been transported. And again, that transport vehicle went to another location maybe and hauled animals that weren't infected and infected those animals. We do share equipment, and if we do, we need to make sure that we follow biosecurity measures between sites so that we don't spread the virus. And then, of course, there's the opportunity through different supplies. So let's talk just a little bit about the opportunity of transmission through vectors. One thing that we hear about, especially in Africa, is the role of the soft tick, the Ornithodoros tick. When that tick is infected, it is infected for life, and the colonies can maintain that virus for many years. It does cause a tick-to-pig transmission. And as I stated, this is very important in Africa and helps maintain that whole cycle between the warthogs and the ticks. And then there's also a role of mechanical transmission, the physical act of the mosquitoes or the biting flies biting an animal that is infected and then transmitting it to a pig who is not, and biting that pig. As far as the role of the Ornithodoros tick in the United States, we do have 5 species of the tick here. The southern United States, possibly present in the western, and maybe a little bit in the Midwest. So there is some concern maybe that the interaction with that tick and our feral swine population. We are not sure at this point what that might look like. One thing to keep in mind that in Africa, the behavior of the warthog is that the animals live in burrows. And so a lot of times you'll have that tick population in that burrow. And so if you have a warthog go from one burrow where they're infected to another burrow and they maintain it in that tick population, or if a warthog goes into a burrow, if the warthog was not infected, then the tick could infect that warthog. And we don't have that same behavior with the feral swine here in the United States. They don't live in the burrows like the warthogs do in Africa. So I think there's still on if there could be a role that these ticks might play if we do get the virus into our feral swine population. So what are the chances of the virus being introduced into the United States through some of the things we've talked about? And you can see here, there, in relation to the number of countries around the world that are actually infected with African swine fever, there are very few listed here because, of course, it's not always an easy task to try to make those epidemiological connections to figure out how it was actually introduced into a country. So you can see here it's listed, and in many cases, it's a matter that they suspect that that's how it got in, according to how they followed the links or how they followed the spread through that country or into that country. But it's very difficult to actually prove that that's how it occurred. So if you look here, you can see again, the uncooked, undercooked pork products fed to pigs has been implicated as a possible intro point in many different countries here. You can see the raw pork waste or the garbage at the airports or shipping ports. And that was believed, the most recent was the Republic of Georgia there in 2007. It is suspected that it is pork waste that came off of a ship and was put into a local landfill, having not been treated. And then the wild pigs in the area then fed off the pork in the landfill and then proceeded to spread the virus. And again, in the United States, the pork waste that comes off of the airports or the shipping out of the ships and the shipping ports, that's all treated. We don't put the raw pork waste here into our landfills. Movement of wild boars has been suspected as one of the intro points in Russia. So while the boars don't move great distances, it can be an opportunity for local spread. And that's one thing that we have concerns, of course, here, that if we do get the virus into the feral pig population, how will it spread within that population? And you can see I have feed ingredients listed there with a question mark. And the question mark is not questioning the role that feed ingredients might play, but it's more so is it a fact that we know or have been able to confirm the introduction of the virus through feed ingredients. And I'm going to defer that discussion to Dr. Jones as I'm trying to set here a bit. This slide, again, slide credit there, you can see to Dr. Scott D. But looking at photos of the different ways that grain is dried in some other countries makes you concerned of the ability of ASF transmission through our feedstuffs into the United States. So again, I'm going to defer to Dr. Jones to continue that discussion as she's the expert in that area. So again, we're concerned here about ASF introduction, of course, into the United States, but then also if it would make it into our pigs, what would it look like as far as spreading once it would get here? Things to keep in mind, again, that in order for our animals in the United States to become infected, it needs to make its way into the country, it needs to make its way onto a farm, and it needs to make its way into the animals. And so the role that that Customs and Border Protection plays to stop that transmission, those items into the United States, as well as the role that producers play on the farm to help protect those animals and keep that virus from entering the farm and infecting their animals. And I do like this quote that was in an article in the National Hog Farmer a couple years ago. The key to controlling African swine fever is biosecurity, biosecurity, and biosecurity, and not necessarily that order. You know, it emphasizes the important need that we play in. I didn't spend a lot of time talking about the indirect transmission routes as far as the role we play with on ourselves, carrying the virus in our vehicles, equipment, and supplies. And that's where our on-farm biosecurity plays such a huge role in making sure that this virus doesn't actually make it onto the farm and infect our animals. So thank you, and I look forward to questions during the panel discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Zabel. Great information there, and I think you did set up very nicely the perspective of the United States, and of course a lot of those best practices can be applied in countries throughout the Americas region. We will do best as a region if we keep ASF out of all of our respective countries, so thank you very much. I want to turn it over to Dr. Cassie Jones. Dr. Jones is with Kansas State University, as Maria mentioned, and works closely with the United States American Feed Industry Association. And so Cassie, please take it away. Again, any questions, please put that in the chat. We will revisit those at the end of the presentations.
Thanks, Courtney, and I appreciate everybody visiting with us and tuning in this morning as we talk about transmission of ASF. And Dr. Zabel, I sure appreciate setting this up quite well on the risk of transmission of ASF associated with feed and feed ingredients. Collectively, these are my big takeaways. We as an industry, as a feed industry, as an ingredient industry, we have a responsibility. I think it's important for us to recognize that animal food is not the most likely way that any foreign animal disease can be transmitted. Pam did a great job talking about direct contact, other fomites, garbage feeding, some of those ways that we know are much more likely to be the initial factor that could bring a foreign animal disease into a country. That said, it's possible that this can be related or transmitted through feed and ingredients. And so because of that, we have a responsibility to take care of our business and our own business. We are relying heavily in the United States, for example, on our Customs Border Patrol and several other entities to make sure that those other lanes of potential transmission have been taken care of. We also, therefore, have a responsibility that even though our risk is smaller to transmit ASF, it's still possible. And so we need to take care of business and do what is right and responsible as we look at bringing ingredients in from different countries and utilizing them in swine-based diets. There are some historical examples of animal food being a source of FAD, or foreign animal disease entry, into a country for the first time. In the United States, we probably are a bit more sensitive to this after the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus epidemic that occurred in the 2013 to 2015 timeframe, where the USDA report said we can't determine the ultimate cause of that entry. However, it's most likely that the PEDV came in from tote bags that were carrying animal food from China. Likewise, we've seen foreign animal disease entry into different countries through animal food in other vectors as well. So rice straw that was coming from China was the most likely source of FMD, or foot and mouth disease virus, entry into Japan, according to their Japanese Ministry of Agriculture in 2001. And the South Korean Animal Plant and Quarantine Agency in 2014 cited that forage and hay from Southeast Asia was the most likely source of foot and mouth disease virus entry into South Korea. So again, it's not like this is the most likely way that we can transmit a virus like ASF into a new environment, but it is possible, and it's occurred historically. And so because of that, we have a responsibility. What we do know about the feed supply chain is that if a pathogen enters it, we can move that pathogen everywhere, and we can move it quickly. And so here is kind of a worst case scenario of what we could consider potential transmission routes throughout the feed supply chain. We could see a contaminated ingredient coming to an ingredient facility in any country. This could be Nicaragua or the United States, but we would bring in a contaminated or affected ingredient, and that would go to an ingredient facility, and from that ingredient facility, go to a variety of different feed mills. Now, a single feed mill is likely bringing those ingredients from a lot of different facilities, and so just one of those could be problematic. That feed mill then feeds a variety of different farms. And that's really where we have this potential risk factor being escalated, where we have just so many pigs that are affected by a single feed mill and a single source of an ingredient. And that ultimately can lead to a contaminated or an infected animal. However, it's important for us to recognize that the same transmission link can actually work in reverse. That there are, as Pam described, a variety of ways that ASF could enter a country and cause infectivity within an animal. And even if that wasn't initially through feed, the feed supply chain can still spread it around once it comes into the country. So for example, maybe we have an infected animal in a barn. Regardless of how that animal got affected, we know that the rest of that barn is now going to be contaminated, as is the feed truck that has delivered feed to that mill, and the mill that was going back and forth from the affected farm to receive feed. Once that mill is affected, that's where our feed supply chain really rapidly becomes contaminated, because now we have probably prevented, if we have strong biosecurity, a lot of farm to farm movement. However, we have not prevented farm to mill to farm movement. And so as soon as that feed mill gets contaminated or has African swine fever virus tracked into it, it's likely that all of the other farms that are feeding animals out of that same feed mill have risk for being potentially affected as well. That risk can also get tracked back into the ingredient facilities by returning ingredient trucks, and ultimately pop entire different systems with the disease and quickly transmit this. The part that's important with the feed supply chain is to recognize not only can this occur both forward and backwards in terms of transmission, but the timing in which this can occur. If we think about how often a barn of pigs gets a feed delivery, that can occur anytime from every 2 weeks to every 2 or 3 days. the incubation period of African swine fever virus from when an animal first is given the dose to the point that they're starting to exhibit clinical signs can vary anywhere from 7 to 15 days. What that means is that if we have an affected animal on a farm, that we could actually make 2 or 3 different feed deliveries to that farm before we recognize, hey, that animal has African swine fever virus and they're shedding, and identify that this is really a problem. In the meantime, we've continued to deliver feed to the feed mills, from the feed mill to other farms, and very quickly this can get out of control where we have lots of epidemiological links from one farm through the feed mill to a variety of other farms. And so this link through the feed supply chain is an important consideration, both through forward transmission, maybe an ingredient was the first place where this came, but also through backward transmission as we think about the role of the feed mill in terms of preventing farm to farm transmission of a virus. That said, how do we stop it? And there are a variety of factors that impact ASF transmission in feed. It's not like this virus magically jumps from an affected animal that's in a field in an affected country to your domestic herd. There are a number of things that have to go right or maybe have to go wrong in order for ASF to actually be transmitted through the feed supply chain into those animals. The very first thing is that the ingredients themselves have to be contaminated. Now, Pam gave some great examples from Dr. Scott D of drying practices that we see in different countries that are ASF positive. We know that there are wild boar present in a variety of those fields and actually seeking cover and seeking housing and food sources in the cornfields and in the wheat fields that then we will be importing that corn or wheat or soy into our own countries. And so initially, we have to have a product get contaminated to start with. The wonderful thing about the United States and our Americas as we continue to work collectively in the Western Hemisphere and be united in this effort is that right now, it's not possible for any of our ingredients to be contaminated. Soy, corn, all of our grains are ASF free because we don't have this number one step where there's the probability or the potential for something like soy to be contaminated in the first place. If a product is contaminated, though, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to lead to infection. It has to be able to survive transport. So where we do have ASF in different countries and maybe where this picture was taken in Eastern Europe, that contaminated product then has to make its way into affected animals in a naive location like the United States or in the Americas, and that virus has to be able to survive that transport. And finally, the resulting dose of the virus that's consumed has to be enough to actually cause infection. And so it's this combination of initial contamination, virus survival, and dose of the virus through an animal food vector, that all of these things need to be considered in order for virus to really be contaminated or to really be transmitted from a source location through the feed or ingredient into the domestic swine herd. So we're going to dig into each of these just a bit further. So the very first one is the likelihood that African swine fever virus is contaminated in ingredients to start with. Again, in the United States, in the Americas, collectively, it's not possible right now. The likelihood is negligible. We don't have African swine fever virus contaminated ingredients that are starting from the Americas. However, as we look at importing ingredients from ASF endemic regions, we do need to start to consider what's the likelihood that they may be carrying the virus. The hard part here is that the method and frequency of contamination are typically unknown. We know that swill or contaminated tissue is one potential route where, as Pam was describing, garbage feeding or swill feeding is not accepted in most areas of the United States and has pretty extreme laws in terms of cooking in other areas. However, that's not the case with all areas where ASF is being transmitted. Contaminated water is a known way that ASF can enter into a system. But then when we look at the ingredients themselves, it's water from a waterway, like in the case of the Danube River being contaminated, pigs either consuming that contaminated water directly or that contaminated water being used in a flooding type situation for irrigating crops, or that the grains or seeds themselves have some type of blood, salivary, or fecal excretion on them. Again, as we look at the pictures of different regions drying soy or drying grains on roadways, it's obvious or easy to assume or determine how it could be contaminated with ASF if we have contaminated animals that are either feeding on this feed stuff while it's drying or being driven over the top of it, like in the pictures that I have shown here. However, this can actually also occur in the field, where maybe we have wild boar who are affected by the disease actually dying within the fields themselves. And then as we go to mow those fields or harvest those fields, we unfortunately spread that carcass contamination throughout the entire area as well. And so the method and frequency of how often are ingredients from ASF endemic countries contaminated, that's really one of the remaining unknown questions regarding ASF. What we do know is that higher risk ingredients are whole grains and seeds from ASF endemic countries. So when we have a country that we know that we have wild boar present with African swine fever virus, whole grains and seeds from those countries are considered to be one of the highest risk sources of transmission. More moderate risk would be if those grains or seeds are processed. So for example, if they're dehulled, the action of removing the hull off of those seeds will at some level at least reduce the probability and the quantity of contamination that was on the outside of that seed or kernel. Of significantly lower risk would be synthetically derived ingredients from the same country. Certainly, there are some feed safety, biosecurity kind of potential issues where there can be cross-contamination that can exist. However, synthetically derived ingredients like vitamins, amino acids, things that really would not have a real way of being contaminated in the first place, they're typically considered to be relatively low risk, even if they come from an ASF endemic country. So what does the data say? I mentioned that we have very little data in terms of the method and frequency of contamination. What we do have are a couple of studies that can point to the overall risk factors here. One is a study by one of my colleagues, Dr. Jordan Gebhardt from K-State. He's working on a project with Vietnam and one of the larger pork producers in Vietnam, which we know is unfortunately positive for ASF and has quite a bit of spread of disease throughout the domestic swine herd, as well as throughout wild boar and wild pig populations in the area. We've been working with this very large modern pork producer in Vietnam for about 2 years now, and we've collected well over 2,000 samples, both environmental samples as well as samples of feeds and ingredients. Of all of the samples that we've collected from the entire feed supply chain, 17 of those 2,328 samples contained DNA that indicated they had been exposed to African swine fever virus. Just 17. So we're talking about 0.7% in an area that we know is endemic for the virus. Of those 17 samples, 0 were from ingredients. 3 were from feed contact surfaces in mills. 4 were from non-feed contact surfaces in the mills, like the floors and the walls. 2 were from people that worked in mills. 1 was in complete feed, and 7 were incomplete or were in feed trucks that were delivering to or from affected farms and then going back into the mill. Based on this data, we believe, at least in the production system that we're working with in Vietnam, that this is not being transmitted through ingredients. We believe that at least in this situation that we're seeing what we would consider backward transmission through the feed supply chain, meaning that we have an affected farm that then gets a delivery of feed from a feed truck. That contaminated feed truck then travels back to the feed mill, and the feed mill is now positive and has the potential to impact both feed as well as some of the feed contact surfaces and workers that are delivering that feed. However, because none of our ingredient samples from Vietnam have been positive thus far, we find very little evidence that there is active ASF transmission through the ingredient portal. However, there is the possibility of it being transmitted through the feed supply chain. And that's an important difference and distinction. So that's some of our field research. We also pair that with controlled research. And so what happens if we do have a contaminated ingredient? In that case, Dr. Megan Niederwerder's lab and Anna Stoyan from Kansas State University have published some great research that describes the survival of African swine fever virus in ingredients when they are contaminated. And so if we take away the part of the question of how frequently are they contaminated, but we do inoculate these ingredients, we actually put ASF on soybean meal or on choline or in feed itself, we know that the greatest survival of African swine fever virus is in choline, conventional soybean meal, and soy oil cake, and that this virus can survive in those ingredients for quite a few days after that initial contamination. And so again, there is risk here, but the risk does vary by ingredient type. Finally, what the final dose or the final component of this would be the dose. So not only do we need to have the initial source of infection, but then we need to pair that with survival to the point that it's fed to animals, and finally enough dose or enough African swine fever virus that it's actually going to cause infection within the animal. Again, this is controlled research out of K-State where Dr. Megan Niederwerder worked with our team to determine the dose that was necessary to cause infection when African swine fever virus is delivered either in feed or in water. What's interesting about this data is that it depends if we have a single exposure versus if we have multiple exposures. So for example, if we have an animal that just consumes one meal and their one meal happens to contain African swine fever virus, that meal requires about 10 to the 4th particles or TCID 50 of African swine fever virus, which is a pretty substantial dose of virus in order to cause infection. But realistically, in the feed industry, a single batch of feed is not just consumed one time by one animal. It's delivered to an entire barn of animals, and that one batch of feed is typically enough for them to consume 20 to 25 meals before the next batch of feed needs to be delivered. In this case, we actually have multiple exposures to a single animal. This is similar to, I like to compare it to the consumption of alcohol, perhaps. One drink might not affect you very much, but if you have 5 or 10 or 20 drinks of the same substance, you're going to start to have a greater probability of being intoxicated. And so that's the same type of thing of what we see with African swine fever virus. If we have a single exposure to an animal, it's not likely that it's going to affect an animal unless it's really strong, unless it's a really strong dose. However, if that same animal consumes lots of small doses, it takes very little virus to actually cause infection because they're consuming it multiple times throughout the day. Now, as we look at this holistically, and we consider all three of these parts together, the likelihood that ingredients are contaminated to start with, the likelihood that that contamination can survive, and that it can survive in a dose that can actually cause infection. When we think about all three parts of those put together, what is the likelihood that feed can actually be a source of entry into a naive country for ASF? The USDA has recently published a qualitative assessment of the likelihood of African swine fever virus entry into the United States. And as we look at feed, we know that collectively there's a negligible to a low risk of feed being the initial source of transmission into the United States. However, it's uncertain. Each of these carries with it a very high level of uncertainty because while we have strong data, we don't have enough data to really best understand the level of contamination, the survival of that product, and the dose that's necessary to cause infection. Similarly, recently, I was fortunate to serve on an EFSA panel with the European Food Safety Authority as they evaluated the relative risk of products based on the modeled number of potentially infected pig farms in non-affected areas of the EU or European Union within the next 12 months. And so what this data described is if we have an area of the European Union that's currently free of African swine fever virus, how likely is it that feed or any of these ingredients will be a potential source of entry in the next year? Again, this is a little bit of a different take on this question because we're working here in a continent where we have shared borders and we have areas that have ASF already. And what they determined is that complete feed is of highest risk. And as we look at different ingredient categories, cereal grains have a higher risk than oil seeds, but those oil seeds have a higher risk than things like tubers or synthetically produced vitamins or amino acids. So my big picture takeaways again from today is that the feed supply chain is not the most likely route of viral entry into animals, but it can quickly spread disease if any part of that supply chain gets contaminated. And so because of that, we all play a role in preventing pathogen entry and spread. And so it's important to do your part. We do our part as we think about where do we source ingredients from, what types of scrutiny do we put on those ingredients. And so my best recommendations would be to exclude high-risk ingredients. For example, many of our current pork producers are completely excluding whole grains and oil seeds from ASF endemic regions or oil seed-based products from ASF endemic regions. We also need to take steps in further minimizing the risk of disease survival and infectivity. Now, this can mean a lot of different things. It may mean that we have minimum holding times for ingredients, like those that I have listed here that have been published by the Swine Health Information Center, where we have minimum holding times for either conventional or organic soybean meal that's being imported from an ASF endemic country. We believe that if we hold this ingredient for these lengths of time, that it's less likely that the ASF that may have been there in the first place survived at a high enough dose to cause infectivity. We also believe that thermal processing with prevention of post-processing cross-contamination and chemical additives where approved, such as the use of formaldehyde or medium chain fatty acids or monoglycerides, do hold some potential to prevent the survival of ASF and its potential infectivity through feed or ingredients. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I will transition it back until we have questions at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Very informational. Please put in questions that you have in the chat. We're now going to transition to our last panelist, which Dr. Antignoli is joining us again from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. In this panel, she's going to be speaking a little bit more about the U.S. government mitigation approach. And while we realize this is not all about the United States, we definitely want to share the work and the knowledge and best practices that have worked in the United States. And it's something for the rest of the Americas region to consider. Please ask any questions in the chat and I will turn it over to you.
Just a minute. Ok. ¿Me pueden escuchar?
Yes.
Ok. Y estoy en el canal que tengo que estar. Ok, muy bien. Buenos días a todos. Me parece que tengo que... Yes. Just a minute. technology is giving me a hard time at this time. All the windows that I have. Okay, here. Just a second, okay?
Yes.
I am having some difficulties here. Okay.
There you go.
All right. Muy bien. Disculpen por los problemas con la tecnología. Estoy aquí para representar un poco la perspectiva del Departamento de Agricultura de Estados Unidos y para conversar de los riesgos de transmisión de la peste porcina africana a los cerdos susceptibles. Entonces, oh, perdón, yo no sé. Oh, ok.
Yo estoy compartiendo por ti, Celia. ¿Quieres que yo cambie las slides?
Ok. Ok, estamos en la primera slide, en la segunda slide, ¿sí? Ok, perfecto. Bueno, ahí vamos. Disculpen otra vez las dificultades. Aquí lo más importante es que todo comienza con un cerdo afectado que va a liberar virus y termina con un cerdo sano pero susceptible que se contagia. Entonces el riesgo es todas las probabilidades de que ese cerdo afectado o sus productos o sus secreciones terminen exponiendo a ese cerdo susceptible e infectándolo. ¿Cómo puede pasar esto? Bueno, generalmente puede pasar con el contacto directo con, del cerdo afectado con un cerdo susceptible. Y para eso, una de las mitigaciones más importantes es todo lo que tiene que ver con bioseguridad de granja. Pero también tenemos la contaminación a través de productos afectados de un cerdo enfermo. Y eso es lo que estamos tratando de prevenir cuando identificamos la alimentación con desperdicios o con basura no regulada o legislada a cerdos susceptibles. O cuando permitimos el acceso de cerdos salvajes a lugares donde se acumulan desperdicios como los basureros municipales. El otro riesgo que se puede ver aquí en el bloque de la derecha es la importación legal o ilegal de producto afectado. ¿Y qué mitigaciones tenemos en su lugar para poder contrarrestar este riesgo? El producto puede llegar de forma ilegal al país. Y por supuesto, se ha identificado que los viajeros internacionales pueden ser un factor de riesgo, como ya lo explicó la doctora Pam. De manera que todos los elementos que puedan contrarrestar la intercepción de esos productos de viajeros son importantes. Acabamos de escuchar los riesgos de la alimentación, de contaminación por la alimentación y las potenciales mitigaciones que deberían estar en su lugar. Y por supuesto, los cerdos afectados que liberan virus en el ambiente pueden contaminar los vehículos y el equipamiento de granja y también las ropas de los trabajadores. Todo esto lo tratamos de capturar con los elementos de bioseguridad de granja. La próxima lámina, por favor. En lo que se refiere a la importación y a los riesgos de importar el virus al país, en Estados Unidos actualmente prohibimos la importación de productos porcinos sin procesar, que incluyan carne de cerdo fresca, refrigerada o congelada, de zonas que están afectadas por la peste porcina africana. Y también prohibimos el ingreso de carne de jabalí o de cerdos salvajes que han sido cosechadas como parte de los eventos de caza de regiones clasificadas afectadas por la peste porcina africana. Todos los demás productos de países o regiones afectados por la peste porcina que ingresan a Estados Unidos deben tener cierta mitigación, es decir, tienen que estar o completamente cocidos o tratados químicamente, o especialmente tienen que estar obtenidos de zonas libres de peste porcina africana reconocidos por APHIS. Y los materiales de investigación que entran, por ejemplo, a laboratorios, universidades, etcétera, que vienen de zonas que tienen peste porcina africana, tienen que ser sometidos a pruebas de seguridad en Plum Island. La próxima diapositiva. Uno de los elementos una de las agencias que nos ayuda a la detección de producto infectado, de producto de cerdo infectado, es la Agencia de Interdicción de Contrabando y Cumplimientos Comerciales. Esta agencia depende de la Agencia de Cuarentenas y Protección Federal, de PPQ. Y lo que hace es detectar y prevenir la entrada ilegal y la distribución de productos que son ilícitos. ¿Cómo se diferencia esta agencia de la Agencia de Control y Protección de Fronteras? Bueno, esta agencia trabaja más que nada en los principales centros de distribución, mercados, ferias comerciales de animales, cadenas de tiendas pequeñas, vendedores en la carretera y en los vecindarios, y promueve la divulgación y la educación al público sobre los riesgos de introducir productos agrícolas que puedan afectar la producción agrícola tanto de plantas como de animales. Esta agencia no trabaja en aislamiento, sino que trabaja en colaboración con agencias federales, estatales y locales para identificar las zonas calientes, los barrios étnicos donde exista la posibilidad de que las personas importen productos nostálgicos de cerdo de países afectados. La siguiente. Otro de los elementos es la regulación de basura de riesgo. La basura regulada es la basura que se genera en las aeronaves y en los botes. Y de acuerdo con el título 7 del Código de Regulaciones Federales, esta basura tiene que estar sujeta a la vigilancia y el cumplimiento de la ley por parte de inspectores. Esta basura tiene que estar contenida dentro de receptáculos herméticos y cubiertos, y tiene que ser a prueba de fugas. No pueden abandonar las naves si no están en estas condiciones, y tienen que ir directo a una instalación aprobada para su incineración, esterilización o trituración. La siguiente, por favor. Esta es la Agencia de Protección de Fronteras, ya se ha mencionado, y esta agencia trabaja fundamentalmente en los puertos de entrada, no solamente para la regulación de productos agrícolas, sino para la regulación de ingreso de productos ilícitos de todo tipo y también de personas inadmisibles. Tenemos más de 1 millón de pasajeros que entran a Estados Unidos por día, y particularmente en la siguiente, next slide, please. Particularmente en lo que hace a los productos agrícolas, trabaja con un grupo de equipos de caninos de agricultura. Estas son las típicas fotos de los perros beagles. Lo que estos perros hacen es detectar productos agrícolas, y en el 2019 detectaron cerca de 27.000 incautación de producto. Durante la pandemia hubo una pequeña reducción de la presencia de estos perros en los puertos de entrada, en parte porque se redujeron los viajes. Pero básicamente hubo presencia en 39 puertos de ingreso con 104 grupos caninos. En el presente, esta agencia está expandiendo sus capacidades para lograr hacia el final de este año tener 189 perros caninos en 43 puertos de entrada. Está en el proceso de contratar 85 entrenadores de perros para el final de este año fiscal, y ha resumido el entrenamiento de los perros, de manera que los nuevos entrenadores y la totalidad de estos perros, estos equipos de perros, van a estar en posición para finales del 2022. La siguiente, por favor. Les quiero mencionar un poco de este programa, que es el programa de desembarco ilegal de botes, que desarrolla particularmente el Servicio Veterinario de APHIS en la isla de Puerto Rico, que es un territorio nacional. Y básicamente, a través de este programa, lo que se hace es la detección de productos de cerdos vivos, y de otros productos animales y subproductos, así como también de plantas y productos vegetales. La siguiente, por favor. Este programa consiste en la detección de botes que desembarcan ilegalmente en diferentes partes de la isla. Puede ser en la parte principal de la isla o en las islas periféricas, como la isla de Mona, de Secheo, Culebra o Vieques. Es un poco dependiente, la frecuencia de estos desembarcos depende de las condiciones del tiempo, por supuesto, y de las condiciones del océano, porque en algunos casos son embarcaciones muy precarias, en otros casos son como flotadores, y por supuesto de la economía, de la situación económica y social de los países de origen, que pueden ser otras islas del Caribe, como también países de Centroamérica. La siguiente, por favor. Este programa se hace en colaboración con la Seguridad de Fronteras, con la Policía Local y Municipal, con los guardacostas y con recursos naturales. Y básicamente es, en esencia, una investigación para los programas de agricultura, es como una investigación de un caso de sospecha. Este programa contiene riesgos y por eso el personal que trabaja en este programa, que participa de este programa, tiene que estar adecuadamente entrenado y tiene que utilizar equipo protector. La siguiente, por favor. ¿Cuáles son los riesgos? Bueno, por supuesto, en estas embarcaciones vienen gente, vienen animales y vienen productos. Muchas veces pasan horas y días en el océano, de manera que puede haber fluidos corporales, materia fecal, contaminantes, elementos punzantes, Y por supuesto puede haber vectores que transmiten enfermedades como la malaria, el Zika, el dengue. Los participantes tienen que estar entrenados para manejar a la gente que viene, que puede estar en condiciones precarias de salud, y también para manejar las condiciones del océano. De manera que esto no lo hace el servicio veterinario en aislamiento, sino que lo hace con otras agencias que tienen la capacitación para lidiar con estas condiciones. Adelante. Entonces, ¿cómo es el protocolo? Cuando existe una notificación de un desembarco, las agencias circulan al lugar y se hace una disposición, una documentación y disposición de los productos agrícolas. Se efectúa un reporte con documentación de la cantidad de producto, de las gentes, y se establece, el servicio veterinario establece un anillo de 3 kilómetros alrededor del desembarco. En ese anillo de 3 kilómetros, el programa inicia una vigilancia epidemiológica de todas las granjas de cerdos en los siguientes 28 días para poder cubrir cualquier tipo de periodo de incubación de cualquier enfermedad. Y lo que hacen es la identificación de todos los puercos que estén en ese anillo y el sangrado para pruebas de enfermedades transfronterizas, una de las cuales es la peste porcina africana. Adelante. Esas muestras se envían luego a Plum Island, que es donde se hacen las pruebas para estas enfermedades transfronterizas. Ya para tener una idea de las estadísticas, hubo 108 eventos en el 2019 y en el 2020 hubo unos 100 eventos, y esas son las incautaciones de producto cárnico y producto derivado de plantas. Adelante, por favor. La doctora Pam Sable habló de las mitigaciones relacionadas con la alimentación de desperdicios y que tenemos 27 estados junto con Puerto Rico y las Islas Vírgenes que permiten la alimentación con desperdicios. Si bien tenemos 33 estados que lo prohíben, es importante que en esos 33 estados se hagan investigaciones de que hay cumplimiento de esta ley. Y así fue, en el 2020 se hicieron cerca de unas 5.000 investigaciones en el país para asegurarse de que en estos 33 estados no hay alimentación con desperdicios. En los estados donde se permite la alimentación con desperdicios, las granjas que lo hacen tienen que estar licenciadas y para obtener esa licencia reciben visitas periódicas donde se tiene que corroborar que la alimentación, que estos alimentos son cocidos a temperatura y tiempo correcto. La temperatura que se requiere son unos 212 Fahrenheit, que son unos 100 grados centígrados por 30 minutos. Básicamente lo que se les pide son generalmente pequeñas granjas con no mucha bioseguridad, pero lo que se les pide es que básicamente pongan esa comida en estado de ebullición por 30 minutos y que es crítico que la remuevan y que controlen la temperatura en diferentes puntos del contenedor. La siguiente, por favor. Y por último, todo lo que se refiere a contacto de fomites, camiones, etcétera, con un animal susceptible, se cubre con la bioseguridad de granja, que la doctora Sable está muy familiarizada, y esto el Departamento de Agricultura lo hace a través del apoyo del Secure Pork Supply, que es básicamente el suministro seguro de carne de cerdo. A través de esta bioseguridad de granja, lo que se requiere es que estas granjas tengan un plan escrito y disponible, bien distribuido de la bioseguridad, que se entrene a los trabajadores. La protección de los cerdos se hace a través de restricciones al ingreso. tanto de que tengan un área de estacionamiento designada, con pocas vías de entrada. En cuanto a los vehículos y al equipamiento, que haya una buena desinfección y limpieza y que se minimice el compartir estos vehículos y equipamiento con otras granjas. La siguiente, por favor. Que el personal de granja sea dedicado y que cumpla con las bioseguridades de entrada y salida, que tengan ropas que estén dedicadas para esa granja, que se bañen para poder tratar de reducir cualquier tipo de contaminación. En cuanto a los animales y al movimiento de semen, es importante controlar las fuentes, que sean de granjas con cierta buen estándar de salud y certificación. Y es importante que tengan los animales que se incorporan a la granja, que tengan un periodo de cuarentena antes de completamente introducirse en el hato. Es importante regular cómo se disponen las mortalidades, cómo se maneja los desperdicios. Tiene un punto de control de vectores y de roedores y de limitar contacto especialmente con los cerdos salvajes. Y por supuesto las condiciones de almacenamiento y de llegada de la alimentación. La siguiente, por favor. Bueno, con esto, este es el final de mi presentación y espero poder compartir con ustedes cualquier respuesta que tengan a sus preguntas. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Celia. That was very informative. We will move into question and answer. So if Cassie and Pam could also join on with your cameras, as well as Maria, that would be great. Maybe, oh, there we are. I didn't have my right screen up. So we do have a number of questions. The first, I think we just want to reiterate specifically, at what temperature is the virus in food destroyed? And it may be helpful just to reference that that is usually determined by the OIE in regards to mitigation for each respective foreign animal disease. So either Celia or Pam, do you guys have the specific heat temperature?
Sí, cómo no. Lo que se busca con las regulaciones para el control de estas granjas que tienen licencia para alimentar con desperdicios es que cocinen los desperdicios a 212 grados por 30 minutos. Estos son 100 grados centígrados. Básicamente se pide que haya ebullición que hiervan el alimento y que sobre todo que la temperatura esté distribuida en forma homogénea. No sé si alguien quiere agregar más.
I think that was very informative. Anybody else have anything to add? Great. Well, I know that our regional director, Carlos Salinas, regional director for USEC Americas, has a question. Carlos, I believe you can come off mute and ask directly.
Great. Yes, I can. Thank you. And good to see everybody. I had a simple question. I was just and I am in Panama right now, but a lot of our region exports aquaculture products to the U.S. and we compete a lot with other regions around the world. For example, India is the largest exporter of shrimp to the U.S. And I know that the practices that we have in Ecuador, for example, they have GMP practices. They have best aquaculture practices set together by the Global Aquaculture Alliance and very good certifications. When you look at different countries around the world that may not follow the right processes, Is there a risk of contamination on aquaculture imports in the U.S. depending on the region, like you have in other animals, or is aquaculture not a potential risk in the whole value chain? I know that hogs are obviously very different and fed differently, and aquaculture is fed differently, but in many cases, the trucks that have the feed and so forth may be the same or shared. So I'm just curious. Not everybody at once.
Sorry, Carlos, I think that you were cutting out a little bit there once in a while. And so I wanted to make sure that you had finished your question. I can take the first stab at it. So certainly we know that shrimp are capable of having infectious diseases, and that infectious diseases, regardless of the type, are really possible of being transmitted through feed and ingredients. We don't know much about the specific diseases that are susceptible to shrimp, that in terms of what the probability is for their contamination and their susceptibility in different ingredients. So unfortunately, the data is pretty limited in terms of what that risk is. What I can give you in lack of data is at least my initial impression. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the majority of that shrimp feed would either be pelleted or extruded. Is that correct? The majority being extruded. And at that point, we know that the step of extrusion, while it's not going to completely eliminate any risk, it does significantly reduce it. And so even if the ingredients themselves are contaminated with a pathogen of concern, that the process of extrusion certainly will likely reach the time and temperature necessary to destroy the pathogen. What we can't guarantee, though, is that we prevent post-processing cross-contamination. And so we see that all the time in the pet food industry as well, unfortunately, where maybe we have a very highly contaminated product coming into the pet food facility, it gets extruded, but then there's some cross-contamination after extrusion during the drying, cooling, or transportation practice. And so we can't guarantee that it's salmonella-free, or in the case of shrimp, pathogen-free completely, but we do know that when we're looking at the broad risk of foreign animal disease, that any of those pathogens of concern would be significantly reduced, if not altogether eliminated, during the extrusion process.
Excellent. Thank you very much. You're on mute, Courtney.
So thank you. Celia, anything to add on that front that Cassie may not have covered?
No, I think that basically, if the product comes from a country that is ASF, what's required is that there are efficient mitigations in place to prevent any contamination. And I think that what the processes that Kathy just mentioned will be an efficient barrier, an efficient mitigation for any risk that could be associated with those.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, our next question, I know we spoke a little bit about the risk to import the ASF virus on feed additives from countries such as, China or other countries that are currently positive for ASF into the Americas region. The question is, could, if employed a quarantine upon destination, could this mitigate the risk? That's probably a question for Cassie.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at that one as well. Certainly, we're utilizing a quarantine time like a time like quarantine as one way of reducing risk. And so we in the United States call it holding time or minimum holding times. I know that there's a question later on in the Q&A as well that I saw pop up about associated with this as well, that's kind of addressing the holding time as well. And so we typically begin our holding time calculations at their point of arrival within the United States or within whatever country that you're concerned about. And so I know one of the questions there is talking about transportation. And so in terms of the United States supply is not likely to be contaminated with ASF and from our supply of soy. However, there is always the potential of that contamination or cross-contamination during transport, where we have vessels that could be loaded or cross-contamination during the transportation process. specifically because of that region, that's why we begin quarantine time calculations once they arrive at our domestic borders and we receive them or have them under our domestic control. That's typically how we operate, where even if we know that a product was exported from India, for example, and it left this port on this date, and it took 22 days to get to this port within our country, we typically don't allow those 22 days of in-transport time to count toward the quarantine. We count at 0.0, beginning when it's arrived in the United States, when we're looking at quarantine or holding time calculations. And part of that is that we believe we know the port of origin in most cases. We believe that we know the port of loading in most cases. But as we've dug into this more and more, we've started to recognize that we may have ingredients that are classified as being from ASF endemic regions, or those that look like they're coming from free regions like Turkey. And so we've seen a lot of additional soy being imported into the United States from Turkey, for example, which is free of African swine fever virus currently. However, when we go back and dig further into where that product was originally grown, unfortunately, a lot of times it's been grown in ASF endemic countries and just has been loaded and transported from the last port of departure being in one of those ASF negative countries. And so it's important for us to understand that global supply chain and how ingredients move and where they move within our country and within and outside of our borders. But again, big picture wise, quarantine is an effective mitigation strategy. It's not going to altogether eliminate the risk, but it will help reduce the risk. And we begin that count of quarantine time once that material is in our domestic borders.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Next question. We have just a couple left, and I know we're running against time, but this one's for Maria. I think because it's about the customer perspective of people that would be importing and utilizing U.S. soy. So, you know, the premise is that, as we've discussed, because the United States does not have African swine fever, the risk of transmission via our U.S. soy or feed exports is negligible. So how are our customers today feeling about, you know, purchasing and importing commodities from the United States? I know that was not the intention of this webinar because that's a concern, at least on my end, but I know we wanted to spread education about something that could mutually affect all countries in our hemisphere. So Maria, do you have any thoughts on that? You're on mute, Maria.
I'm sorry about that, sorry. Well, one of the reasons we're sponsoring this webinar is because we believe that education is key to fight this disease. So we are always and constantly providing up-to-date and relevant and pertinent information to our customers. So they have that information, they can process that and into their operations, and they can be sure our processes in U.S. facilities, the processing of the U.S. soybean to produce soybean meal is very secure. And obviously the handling and the storage of the grains, it's always very secure as well. So they can be rest assured that we are offering a high quality product, but obviously there's no, or the likelihood of having exposure to the African swine fever virus in their countries is very low. However, as Cassandra said, cross-contamination risk is always there. So they have to be very careful and obviously maintain and implement biosecurity measures in their operations as well to make sure that ingredient is safe.
Thank you. And I think that's a great note to end this session on. If you have additional follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us at USEC. We're happy to continue this discussion. And indeed, we'll be doing so in our third of 3 seminars in this African swine fever series in the Americas region. This will be next week on the 21st of July. Same time, starting at 8 a.m. Central Time.